Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar for today. Uh, I'm glad that we are celebrating the Whistleblower Day today. This is a very rare question where we can get. I mean, I'm surrounded by three beautiful roses today. With us, actually, with the one and only Miss Cynthia Gabriel. Yeah, Mr. Gabriel is with us. We also have Miss Vivian Vilpan with us. Hi, Miss Vivian, how are you? Miss Cassandra, Cynthia, how are you? And Miss
I'm
Cassandra,
good.
how are you? Yeah, yeah, good to see you. And Miss Cassandra, are you? Yeah, Miss yeah, they're there. So see, these are the three beautiful ladies, but don't play with them. They are really strong in this topic today. Let me share with you a bit about the background for our speaker today. Miss Cynthia Gabriel yourself is a wow factor. Someone who's been invited by the President of the United Nations to address for some very important topic. It's a really honor, madam, to have you with us. You are the founding director of the Center to Combat Corruption and Terrorism, C4, as a very high post. It's a very important post, which is I think is a very we will love the audience will love to hear more from you. And we join with two beautiful from another speaker from Mak Wen Kwai. Yeah, we have Miss Vivian. Miss Vivian is uh, uh, she has a bachelor in law from University of Wales, right? Yeah, look young but highly experienced. You can visit our website. Can look. There's a list there. Very impressive. And not the least, Miss Cassandra, you're also with a law background, Bachelor of Law from University of somewhere from Newcastle, right? So you've been in this industry very long. So I will not chit chat anymore. Just like to pass the baton to Miss Cynthia Gabriel. Miss Cynthia, if you don't mind, can you just start the session by sharing your about the topic today? The floor is yours, Miss Cynthia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inche Suhaimi. Thank you to the ABEC Center for Excellence for inviting me. And a happy World Whistleblowers Day. I'm not sure about the happy part, but we have to take this in a very positive light because I think this entire initiative by your good selves and by many around the world actually showcase how important whistleblowing is in combating corruption. But in particular today, I'd like to recognize the many private sector participants who have signed up to this event. And that is actually something that is very exciting for me because more and more we are realizing that corporates and private sector play a very, very important role in developing corporate integrity, good governance, and most of all, to actually stem the very rising corruption problems in the country today. So it's a collective action issue. It's an issue that requires different stakeholders to actually take part. I also wanted to share a couple of slides. I'm going to try to see if I can do that, but it's not happening. Um, so let me just begin by starting on this topic on why speak up in Malaysia and whether there are rights for reporting persons. And I know that the two previous colleagues, Ms. Cassandra and Vivian, after that will get into the law a little bit more. But what I did want to do today is to actually provide a context on what is it that whistleblowing is about in Malaysia and why blowing the whistle is so central to actually fighting corruption in this country. And the more whistleblowers actually speak up, the more we can actually take collective action to weed out this corruption scourge. Now, are there rights? And I think this is a very important topic to actually speak about today. Now, if we look at the next slide, can we go on to the next slide? Okay. There's actually protection internationally under the UN Convention Against Corruption, or the UNCAC in short. And it was ratified by Malaysia on the 24th of September in 2008. And it says here that Article 33 of the UNCAC actually looks at the protection of reporting persons, and it provides really for whistleblower protection. So this is the protection for people who actually want to report wrongdoing, etc. But as we know, even around the world today, when we celebrate World Whistleblower Day, we have two and more, of course, very important developments that have happened. This morning, I watched a documentary on BBC, something that was highlighted by one of my international colleagues, that talked about whistleblowing in the United Nations. And it was quite incredible that even an organization as international and as large and respected as the United Nations also have very serious issues of abuse of power, malpractice, etc., in which now internally with the whistleblowing mechanisms within the UN are also being brought to light and empowering staff and employees within the organization to start reporting. So this is actually a very good example. Another very disturbing case is the extradition of Julian Assange from WikiLeaks. This case has been going on since 2010, and I think we all know that it was really very serious cable leaks that were actually brought to light by WikiLeaks, the organization. Now, if we look at the next slide, I wanted to actually put into context that as we struggle to look at whistleblower protection in Malaysia and everywhere else, we actually have a Whistleblower Protection Act enacted here in 2010. And that was quite fast, actually, because while Malaysia ratified the UNCAC in 2008, 2 years after that, as part of the obligations to the international convention, local laws needed to be stepped up to combat corruption. And here is the preamble of the Whistleblower Protection Act. It's been 12 years. There are many challenges within the Act itself, but the preamble tells you the basis and the crux of what this whole thing is about. That the aim is to combat corruption and other wrongdoings by encouraging and facilitating disclosures of improper conduct in public and private sector, to protect persons making those disclosures from detrimental action, to provide for matters disclosed to be investigated and dealt with, and to provide for other matters connected therewith. It sounds good, right? It sounds like as if our rights are actually codified even in our local laws. But here then, where I actually want to bring us to some of the real challenges, because I've had real experience of trying to blow the whistle, for example, and, you know, it turns out to be something quite difficult, quite scary even for an average citizen to actually want to report a particular wrongdoing. And the higher the person, the bigger the power, the more difficult it is to hold power to account. And that's why protection of whistleblowers are extremely important. Now, the next slide actually shows us who really is a whistleblower. How do we recognize what is a whistleblower, especially in corporate companies, in the private sector, and also in the public sector? It could be any person who discloses information about someone pertaining to wrongdoing occurring in the public or private sectors. An example could be a civil servant, an employee of a private organization, or even a company that can actually lodge a complaint. The wrongdoing may be classified in many ways: any kind of violation, a fraud, an unethical activity, abuse of power. And in this case of the Whistleblower Protection Act, there is a lot of emphasis on malpractice and lodging reports around corruption. So disclosures can be made internally. But I want to take us to slides later on that actually talk about why it's so difficult for whistleblowing in corporations, whistleblowers in private sectors, in SMEs, in private settings, to actually link to bigger and larger investigations. So the following slide will actually take us to a couple of examples. I already talked about the big ones, the WikiLeaks, and that we're now looking at serious extradition issues of a truth seeker. Many people around the world say that because Julian Assange was so controversial and he got involved in other accusations and violations, that his extradition is something which is a lot more complicated. The next one was on Enron, and I think many of us already know the story of Sharon Watkins, who was a vice president of Enron International. It was one of the biggest firms in the United States at that time, and she had warned her boss of an impending implosion in the company. But because it was overlooked, the corporate fraud was actually not really dealt with seriously. It was eventually forced into closure. There's a whole lot of information on Enron, but the interesting part was that there was an inside person, a leader in such a big company that was actually trying to forewarn her bosses that there was something really wrong with the accounting process and that whistleblowing actually came with hardship. Despite her position as a vice president, there was a lot of issues in which she herself was sent to the cold storage. She herself was actually moved from the executive floor, not given any real work to do in many instances. And later on only, she was actually awarded a large sum in compensation and reward for actually speaking up. So the process is actually a very, very difficult one. As we would see in the next slide, we have enough examples in Malaysia. Next slide, please, on Malaysian examples. Now, 1MDB is this thing that is continuously spoken in our Malaysian courts. After 7 years of actually being exposed by international whistleblowers, actually, we had Xavier Justo, who was the primary whistleblower, who was actually the one who discovered a lot of the malpractice in PetroSaudi International, of which he was a director and a senior personnel. He tried to sell the information and make a profit out of it. But eventually, the many actors that tried to get the information also did not really meet their end of the goal. And he was eventually found and arrested in Thailand. Later, he was pardoned by the Thai king. And when there was a monumental change in our government, Xavier Justo actually came to Malaysia several times to talk to many media, to talk about his harassment and many different things. And then there were other journalists from Wall Street journals, Claire Rucastle from Sarawak Report, and many other international journalists who were then barred from entering Malaysia during the 1MDB time. So we know this story and we know the matter is still in court. But we want to recognize that without whistleblowing in such big corporations and companies, we would never have known the extent of the corruption that actually took place with the people in the highest echelons of power. And this is the power of whistleblowing. This is the central pillar of what is needed to actually fight the scourge of corruption. Another example is the example of another infamous one. This one, I think many of us know as a lembu duduk dalam kondo experience of Rafizi, who is a politician. And he highlighted something called the National Feedlot Corporation, of which 250 million was actually siphoned off by a company who was led by the husband of a former minister, etc. So Rafizi was sentenced to 30 months of jail by the Sessions Court. But later, he was, of course, freed because the higher courts, the Court of Appeal and the Federal Court, had actually dismissed his charges. So he was charged for defamation and he was also charged for leaking bank details, which are meant to be actually secret and private. So at that time, there was a BAFIA. There's no more Banking and Financial Services Act. It has been replaced by the Financial Services Act now. and Rafizi has been freed of both charges. So this is actually a celebration for whistleblowers in Malaysia, but the journey that he had taken to be charged in court by powerful corporates, to be tried in court for two things, for defamation as well as for leaking information, uh, private banking information. So he was tried on two different trials separately. Now, these are heavy examples, these are big examples, but these are just examples to show that the importance of whistleblowing in actually calling out corruption. And it is, and I'll agree because I have my own story to tell when I tried to blow the whistle on a submarine deal, that oftentimes the authorities come after the complainant and not investigate the complaint. But we want to change all that. And we want to look at where the legal loopholes are, as well as where the challenges are, mainly also for collective action by the private sector. So next slides, the next few slides, will actually look at something I picked up from the MECC website. This is until 2020, but nothing much has changed in terms of the number of complaints received. If you look at the figure at the bottom, the complaint received per year for that year was 77,073. All kinds of complaints received through various means. But for whistleblowing, whistleblowers who actually came forward to the MECC was only 536. And that's not even 5% of the number of complaints that MECC received on various forms of abuse, malpractice, and corporate fraud, anti-corruption complaints, etc., etc. So this actually tells us something. Another point which I wanted to raise here is the confidence level, or if I may put it more bluntly, the trust deficit that many Malaysians may have currently in law enforcement institutions for various reasons. Maybe fear factor, the fear of reprisal, the fear of being found out that a complaint was actually lodged, the fear of actually being harassed because we ourselves went forward to lodge a complaint. And the number of whistleblowers in this country have been really, really small. And I think that is a very important point of reflection to ask ourselves today in recognition of World Whistleblowers Day and in recognition for the importance of the role of whistleblowers in fighting corruption. We actually take so little effort to take it to the law enforcement. And there are many reasons, many good reasons why perhaps even law enforcement institutions need to reform themselves and show themselves to be a lot more defined, a lot more independent, and a lot more neutral without any kind of political influence in how they do their job. So this is actually a very important slide, and I was shocked when I saw the numbers that were actually being presented on the MECC website. So if we look at the next slide, where then did we go wrong? There is protection under the Whistleblower Protection Act. On paper, Section 7, 9, 10 actually talks about protection of confidential information, of the identity of the informant. There's immunity from civil criminal action, including disciplinary action for the whistleblower while the investigation is going on. Protection against retaliatory action, also known as detrimental action. For example, in a private sector, a private company, so you'll be protected against knee-jerk reactions like sudden termination or being put into the cold storage or freezing your contract, etc. And anyone who takes detrimental action against the whistleblower or anyone related to or associated with the whistleblower will be subject to a fine not exceeding 100,000 or imprisonment not exceeding 15 years or both. But then let's move on to the next slide. If we look at Section 6 of the Whistleblower Protection Act, that says that a person may make a disclosure of improper conduct to any enforcement agency based on reasonable belief that the person has engaged or is engaging in some kind of malpractice. However, there are limits here, and this is what I actually wanted to highlight, that what is prohibited by any written law which prohibits disclosure of information, protected under laws like the Official Secret Act. And just now I mentioned Rafizi's case on the Banking and Financial Institutions Act, BAFIA, as well as Section 203A of the Penal Code, which basically restricts civil service and civil servants from exposing confidential information. So there is a real clash now of the Act. And Section 62C is actually in respect of information acquired by the person while he or she was an officer in a public body or an officer of a private body that actually wants to report a particular complaint and malpractice. So herein lies another challenge for the Whistleblower Protection Act, that it is actually subservient to the OSA and the Banking and Financial Institutions Act and other secrecy laws. So if we cannot, for example, reveal confidential information, then it becomes very problematic, say, for example, for journalists who actually want to report something, for anti-corruption activists who want to report something, and to actually take the entire bulk of information and report it to the law enforcement, etc. But Section 6, if we look at the next slide, also tells us that, next slide please, that a whistleblower, when they report the information only to law enforcement, they will be conferred with protection. The protection of confidential information, immunity from civil, criminal action, and protection against detrimental action. This protection is not limited in the event of disclosure of improper conduct and does not lead to disciplinary action or prosecution as mentioned just now. But there's something really serious here, that a whistleblower can only lodge a complaint with the law enforcement. So for example, if the law enforcement takes a lot of time or remains silent and does not actually feed back any information to the whistleblower, that whistleblower, you and I, if we are whistleblowing on something, will not be able to even take it to, say, our member of parliament, elected representative, state assembly, or anyone that we feel we can trust to actually raise the problem in parliament or anywhere else. So you immediately lose your protection after that. And the next two slides will actually show us that. So can we move to the next slide about the next one? Next slide. The revocation of whistleblower protection is actually embodied under Section 11. Now, this is in simple terms that if you have actually violated the different provisions and limitations under the Whistleblower Protection Act, for example, lodging a report outside the law enforcement, and also revealing confidential information, there are various elements to ensure revocation of your protection as a whistleblower. So next slide, please. Okay, I want to bring our attention to this. There was actually a case, and a very interesting one, in which a company executive was charged under the Whistleblower Protection Act, the first one. But unfortunately, last month or so, it was decided by the judge that the case would be dismissed because there was not enough evidence to actually charge. This case was actually under the Education Malaysia Global Services, EMGS, in which the official, Wafi Abdul Aziz, was charged under Section 3B, the Whistleblower Protection Act, for having caused the company employee to be fired after providing information to the MACC regarding misconduct committed by the accused. Section 10.3b criminalizes retaliatory action against any whistleblower or those related to him and is punishable by 15 years and all that. That was already highlighted. So unfortunately, because of a lack of prosecutions trying to build a case around this whole issue of a whistleblower being fired for providing information to the MECC, unfortunately for the whistleblower, Wafi Abdul Aziz was also then free because the whistleblower case was dismissed. Now, this actually highlights the importance now of amending certain clauses of the Whistleblower Protection Act, which I will talk about in my last slide later. But right now, to actually show us that we have reached a point where a whistleblower could be brought to court by a company exec and so on and so forth, which means we actually all now, as private sector leaders, as corporates, trying to lead the charge around fighting corruption and building corporate integrity, actually do need to know the Act in a little bit more detail. So the Whistleblower Protection Act now actually has a lot more importance placed on it after 12 years, with a lot of efforts around trying to amend legal loopholes and to actually look at how we can strengthen whistleblowing in general in Malaysia. Now, the next slide will actually show us some limits. As I mentioned, whistleblowers can only report cases to enforcement agencies. Whistleblowers cannot make disclosures on information that fall under secrecy laws, such as the OSA, Capital Market Services Act, Section 203 of the Penal Code, etc. And potential whistleblowers can be excluded from receiving protection. So these are some of the limits of the current Act. Now, the next slide will actually talk to where we are trying to go with this, the difficulties in reporting, for one. And when we talk about whistleblowing in the corporate sector, I think one of the things I wanted to highlight here is, are there enough mechanisms internally, especially in SMEs, smaller private sector organizations, whether there are actually frameworks? Is there a mechanism, and whether there are any challenges in actually reporting a particular malpractice? It could be something on an issue of ethics. It doesn't all have to be about financial crimes. It could be about bullying or abuse of power. But if we wanted to report something, there should be a mechanism. And is there one? And I think this is where several lawyers are putting their heads together to actually look at providing more training, providing more capacity building around various uncertainties, how to develop better whistleblower protection mechanisms in the workplace, and uncertainty over which law is violated and the lack of clarity over the procedures that are involved, and also whether they will be protected. So whistleblowers are often not regulated and not regularly updated, and sometimes long periods of silence. So there are several trainings that we have conducted at C4, for example, for environmental groups and communities that have been affected by pollution and polluting industries. So they go and complain because they see, for example, illegal factories burning plastics in the middle of the night, and they want to go and report it to the police and to the MECC. But because their lives are threatened, it's about air pollution, water pollution, etc., they hear nothing from the authorities for so long. So they want to go to their members of parliament, but then they would lose their protection. And another big problem is sometimes whistleblowers are also motivated by rewards. Will I get something in return for sticking my neck out? So the issue of rewards in the Whistleblower Protection Act are not transparent, as many other things in this country, and it's also not made public. So even if a case goes up to MECC investigations and eventually goes to court, there are no readily established rewards that you could get a cash compensation, like in the case of Enron, or you could get some kind of recognition for being brave, and you should be celebrated as a whistleblower and not chastised, not harassed. And so the various mechanisms are not properly dealt with in the law. And of course, in this country, the fear of reprisal is also not properly addressed. And selective prosecution is very much in practice by the authorities. It depends on who you are, whose side you're on, and if you're somebody's friend or a crony of somebody, it depends on what kind of treatment you would get, which is also not a very healthy thing to operate in this country, and something that we all need to fix together, hopefully with collective action. So if we move on to the next one, this is where I think the concentration of the discussion for this morning will take place. And this is what we have since June 2020, when Section 17A of the MECC Act was actually brought into force. Now, why is this so important? Now, if we know how corruption takes place, the most prominent way of understanding corruption, and it's not all about bribery, but bribery is very, very real in dealing with business practices, in trying to get deals cut, in trying to get a license, in trying to get a permit, in trying to get many different leads to actually run business. So if we talk to any business, whether small scale SMEs, medium scale companies, or large corporations, a lot of them would say that because corruption is so rampant in the country, that sometimes it is just normal that you grease the wheel with bribes, with over the table bribes, or sometimes it used to be under the table. But as cartoonist Zuna had always said, now it's also going with the table. So it has become so blatant. It has become so rampant everywhere that there were sufficient rules that were needed on corporate liability, on rules that were actually required to ensure that the so-called bribe givers were those that were also regulated by the law. That for corruption to take place, you need evidence that there was a receiver and there was a giver. That the giver was the one that initiated the corrupt action, and the receiver was the one who actually completed the corruption crime. So for the longest time, before Section 17A and corporate liability provisions were incorporated into anti-corruption laws in this country, we focus a lot on the bribe receiver, the civil servant, the middleman, the many people who actually accepted bribes to move a certain action. But many a time, the real givers of the bribes were also protected under the Companies Act, the corporate veil, and now another movement on beneficial ownership, that the real directors of the company need to then be transparent about who the real beneficial owners are, and no longer about putting in proxies and so on. So Section 17A is not really an act to frighten off the corporate sector. It is actually an act to help facilitate adequate procedures that will help different scales of companies. The larger ones, of course, have more resources to employ integrity officers and so on to ensure better compliance, due diligence, etc. But the SMEs also is where more help is needed from the government, from the legal fraternity, and many other sectors of trainers that can actually incorporate trust principles. So you need top-level commitment. Top-level commitment means the bosses, the directors have to actually show why they would actually take initiatives to develop adequate procedures. You need good risk assessment mechanisms and to undertake control measures, as well as to do periodic review, monitoring, enforcement, training, and communication. There's a package of everything that is needed. Now, why is this important? Because despite having many regulatory frameworks in the past, this is now a law. And it's a strict liability provision, something that has been embodied from the Section 7 of the UK Anti-Bribery Act, that now places the responsibility on the top level commitment to ensure that the only protection they can have from being charged under Section 17A is to show that there are adequate procedures in companies, that there are adequate procedures enough for a mechanism to allow reporting persons to lodge a complaint with full confidentiality, with full trust that there will be investigations that will be taken, that everything will be watertight in terms of information that's given, so that the whistleblower will feel confident enough and ensure that he won't run the risk of reprisals. And I think this is a very, very good and positive movement forward for stemming corporate fraud, for actually building better corporate integrity and due diligence. Because I believe that many corporates invest a lot in compliance measures and due diligence. So now you just add this, Section 17A. Okay, so onward to the next slide. Is to find synergy between the Whistleblower Protection Act and Section 17A of the MECC Act. Now, right now, one of the loopholes in the Whistleblower Protection Act is it does not impose a requirement on corporations to introduce whistleblowing policy in the organizations. But I'm going to update you shortly about how that is changing. But we do have corporate governance guides issued by Bursa that does state that listed companies must ensure appropriate practices. Now, what about the non-listed ones? And I think this is where we actually want to focus on that. So even if we look at today's news and what is splashing all over the news, we have a company that is called UKSB, Ultra Kirana Sdn Bhd, that has already now been exposed in a court trial of Zahid Hamidi, the current UMNO president and former home minister back in 2017 and all that, when there was a foreign visa contract that was actually awarded to Ultra Kirana, and the amount of political donations that were made, illicit donations, because there was no mechanism to regulate political donations. There is still no mechanism to regulate political donations, but the amount of money that ran into millions that were paid to all these politicians in order for them to get the contract, in order for them to have continuity over the contract after the change of government, in order for them to just be awarded that very lucrative contract. So this is what we are trying to stop. We are trying to find a way that even for officials who may have found out that there were transgressions, there were malpractices, there must be a way to actually report. And there are a lot of good people that exist in our society today. So we have to encourage the culture of reporting, the culture of ensuring better integrity. But we also have to find mechanisms to ensure that the reporting isn't one for competition and pushing off a competitor in the private sector, because things are very competitive in there to climb up the corporate ladder. That the complaint has to be authentic, has to be genuine. And this is where the authorities have to actually help filter out a good complaint from a complaint that is filled with bias and filled with venom, etc., etc. Now, how could we incorporate some of these reporting in the workplace cultures under Section 17A. And Section 17A, Part 4 of the MECC Act actually gives us room to figure that out. And I think this will be developed a lot more by the speakers after this. So next slide, I just have a few more slides left, is to look at ESG. Now, companies, everyone's talking about the ESG framework, the environmental, social, and governance frameworks for companies. It's a good framework. It's a nice framework, but it also runs the risk of greenwashing. It runs the risk of just doing an ESG framework for the sake of it. But more and more in international settings in the European Union and the US, for example, incorporating whistleblowing into ESG disclosures, into ESG information on environmental sustainability, on corporate governance, etc., is actually now the order of the day. How can we find the convergence of these two landscapes? Internal whistleblower communications, very, very important, which is to set up a reporting mechanism. Public reporting procedures, which must be very, very clear about how it's done. And internal controls, including regular policies and trainings for different levels of staff members, for personnel in companies, that they can actually see that in trying to promote environmental sustainability and corporate governance, that whistleblowing must be at the center of how the communications in the office should be, that more and more disclosures, open data, open information should be made available in order for the whistleblower to have really the right information in order to lodge a complaint. Now, the last and next slide that I have is what I want to show you now. I've been lucky or privileged enough to be part of a government task force. And normally the government doesn't really invite vocal people to sit in the task force very much, but I got into it. I also was appointed into the formation of the National Anti-Corruption Plan for 2019 to 2023. And whistleblower protection is one of the very important emphasis of trying to fight corruption. It is now just that there's so much political uncertainty in this country that we're really not sure where the country is going in terms of power grabs and next elections coming up, and we're not sure about foreign investment. We're not sure about post-pandemic renewals, etc. But what we are sure of is that we need to fight the corruption scourge, and we need collective action to do that. We need the corporate sector to do that. So there is a government task force now to look at the amendments to the Whistleblower Protection Act. So we are part of it. And there are lots of government agencies in there, lots of law enforcement agencies, and a couple of business consultants that have been incorporated to actually look at this one that I'm showing you, reporting procedures in the workplace. And this is one of the sections that are being studied in a very, very big way on how the synergy can actually take place, that now with the amended Whistleblower Protection Act, which is supposed to be brought to Parliament soon, anytime soon. Actually, it was supposed to be brought in March this year, but it didn't happen for obvious reasons of party hopping and all kinds of problems in the country, is that reporting procedures in the workplace will now be incorporated into the Whistleblower Protection Act. At least that is the plan. That the Whistleblower Protection Act, after 12 years of operations, will now incorporate a section on reporting procedures in the workplace. So if there are corrupt elements in a particular complaint, then MECC will pick it up and investigate further. But the reporting procedure in the workplace will be the first channel of a reporting mechanism for every country. And that is duly now going to be recognized as a very important proposal to the amendments to the Whistleblower Protection Act. And these complaints are supposed to be picked up more and more by the MECC so that Section 17A also will be properly enforced and that whistleblowing becomes very central to our compliance, due diligence, and different kinds of ways in which we can safeguard our companies from being engaged in corporate fraud, corporate corruption, and become also very AMLA compliant. The money laundering rules must also be tightened and must also be looked into very, very seriously. So I would like to stop there because I think my half an hour is also a little bit of time already. But I'm looking forward to more conversations during the Q&A because this is something I'm hoping to learn from different mechanisms that are already developed, because there are many companies who are already doing this and many companies who have good examples to share. So thank you very much, Inche Suhaimi, for bearing with me and for everyone else in this room for listening to a bit of a context on whistleblowing. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's a beautiful opening from your side. So many information. We are very useful to us, and we're very truly grateful. Surely you are truly a subject matter specialist, and no wonder you received the prestigious Democracy Award from the National Endowment for Democracy from the U.S. Congress, Mr. Rand Paul. My God, this is something very, very, very good. Before I move to the next presenter, Ms. Cynthia, just would like you to enlighten us further because I'm attracted to your comment on people whistleblower would like to raise a concern regarding the wrongdoings, Ms. Cynthia. But there's this thing called the inner value between the honesty and loyalty, honesty to yourself, to the company, and loyalty to yourself and companies. So what's your take on this? So should I be whistleblower because of this? Is it there?
Well, for me, at least, loyalty and honesty should be part of a connecting value, because it's important to ask the loyalty is to whom and what. If the loyalty is to make money, even though you know that there is something not right about how that particular revenue is earned, then there's a compromise on the honesty. But if your loyalty is to your boss, which is a very common feature in everywhere, whether you're in the civil service or private sector or non-profits, usually it's very hard to criticize your boss or report on your boss, even though you know your boss is the one that is doing. So we have this very infamous culture in this country called ikut arahan dari atas, or just take instructions from the top, because I'm disempowered to act on my own based on honesty. So honesty principles are very difficult to operationalize. It requires courage. So the issue of loyalty is a very, very challenging one, and it is something that we all perhaps need to work towards strengthening each other. And the only way to do it is to have enough structure to support the honesty that won't be attacked, So that's the quick answer to loyalty and honesty. My take.
There's no easy answer for when we talk about loyalty and to your company, to yourself, and honesty to your. But I understand where it's coming from. Is actually, but like yourself, you are the advocates for human rights. When talk about your human right, you need to do the right thing. Need to do the right thing. Yeah. So I guess I move to another speaker for today. Miss Cassandra, is it your turn? Yeah, it's for you. Are you ready, Miss Cassandra? Yeah.
Yep, thank you very much. Right, first and foremost, thank you very much to the ABAC Center for inviting us. And I would just like to say as well to Miss Cynthia, it was a great presentation. Most of our top points have also been covered, but we'll go in a little bit more detail. And thank you very much for doing that introduction. Saved us a little bit more of our top points as we go along as well. I'll get straight into it. As an introduction today, myself, I am a partner at Marwin Kwai & Associates, graduated with a Bachelor of Laws, and I was called to the Bar of England and Wales. With me today, I do have our senior legal associate, Vivian, and she will be joining us as a speaker later to give you the criminal aspects and a little bit more detail as to the Whistleblower Protection Act 2010. Vivian has graduated from Cardiff University and was also called to the English bar, and she generally practices in criminal litigation and general litigation as well. So without further ado, I'm just going to dive right in. Our main talk points today, which we're going to cover, is what exactly corruption and bribery entails. Most of you might be thinking, why do we have to go into this? This is a whistleblowing talk. It leads a lot to, as Ms. Cynthia was saying, corruption and bribery in the corporate sector is what I will be taking on. It is what we advise on in clients as well when it comes to drafting of their ABAC policy and drafting of their whistleblowing policies as well. I will then give a brief background as to the new Section 17A of the MACC Act 2009, what it entails, what adequate procedures must be included as well. And most clients come to us as well to ask, what should we be including? And this is very important to know because it's very important, and with the statistics that Ms. Cynthia has also pointed out, it's very alarming. And we need to know what exactly companies can do, what individuals can do in order to safeguard themselves and safeguard whistleblowers. And this is important given the protection under the Whistleblower Protection Act as well. And then Vivian will come in to explain a little bit more detail about the sections which protect whistleblowers and the exceptions to protection as well. Right, so we'll dive right into corruption and bribery. What you see on the screen here is the main definitions for corruption and bribery. Corruption, of course, being any lawful or improper behavior that seeks to gain an advantage through illegitimate means. Bribery, which is a form of corruption, and this involves obviously receiving and giving of bribes. These two go hand in hand together, one. Secondly, it can be dissected into a variety of different parts. What we need to understand is what such unlawful and improper behavior is, what exactly amounts to illegitimate means. And this is part of what we might be dissecting as well in the remaining of my slides, as to the types of actions which corporations should take note of. Is it a pen? That's a form of bribery. Is it a lavish dinner? Is it a holiday perhaps that you might take your client? Or what are these things that it can be government officials or it can be third-party vendors? What are the different things that amounts to corruption and bribery, and what makes it illegitimate or not? So here we come down to a little bit more of a dissection of corruption. Includes bribery. Corruption is an umbrella term which includes bribery, and abuse of power, fraud or deception, or embezzlement as well. Embezzlement is it's an area which is up and coming now and very prominent as well in corporations that we need to take a look at and give some highlight to the cautions that directors and shareholders in the company need to take, especially top management. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Bribery. Bribery is a form of corruption which involves the receiving or giving of bribes. Now, what amounts to gratification is key here. Most of our clients include in their ABAC policy, and I'll give you a step-by-step breakdown as well of what is typically included. The terms and the definition of gratification very comprehensively. We always advise our clients gratification must be defined in the most comprehensive manner as possible, so that as to avoid ambiguity as what is included in the gray area. This boils down to small tiny things as to gifts, money, what amounts of money, is it 1 ringgit, is it 5 ringgit, is it 50,000, is it 10,000? When it comes to gifts, is it a pen, is it a dinner, is it plane tickets to go on a lavish holiday? What amounts to those gifts obviously are subjective as it goes along between different corporations, between different companies, and between different government-linked offices as well. And I'll show you snapshots of what different organizations have included in their policies. Commissions as well. Now, this is a bit of a gray area, commissions, because a lot of people will then ask the question when it comes to gratification and commissions. You also have things like, real estate property agents. There's a percentage of commissions given when you do dual work. And this is the area where it's talked about a lot because commissions is a thing of Malaysia and everyone knows that. And this is something that needs to be digested, it needs to be dissected, and it needs to be discussed. So corruption and bribery in a corporate sector, there are a few examples, and this is minimal that I'm giving you what you see on the screen here. There's obviously a little bit more of a comprehensive scope as to the types of corruption and bribery that can go on in a corporate sector. Examples include accepting gratification from clients, third parties, government officials, the offense of giving or accepting it by an employee, corruptly procuring tender of business. This is quite common, especially when you're trying to obtain a tender for a business, and you know someone who is in that company employee, or you're trying to get that business deal, or you're trying to offer something in some sort of way. Bribery of an officer of a public body, bribery of a foreign public official, an offense of using office or position for gratification, and this is usually for more of the top management, directors, and senior levels. Now, what exactly is Section 17A? Ms. Cynthia has been kind enough to already introduce us to Section 17A. This only has been recent. It's come into force on the 1st of June 2020, and it introduces now something called corporate liability on commercial organizations in Malaysia. Again, dissecting here of the different aspects of what corporate liability is required. You've got corporate liability on commercial organizations. Now you have to beg the question, who are commercial organizations? Who fall under Section 17A? What exactly is corporate liability? Again, with ethical conduct and whistleblowing being promoted very heavily into a larger extent in Malaysia nowadays, this has come significantly at a time because of the enforcement of Section 17A of the MACC Act as well. What exactly does Section 17A involve? It basically sets out a commercial organization commits an offense if a person associated, and I'm going to highlight the word here, associated, with the commercial organization corruptly either gives, agrees to give, promises, or offers to any other person gratification, regardless of whether it's for the benefit of themselves or if it's the benefit for another person with the intent to obtain business. I'll give you an example here. It could be an employee of a company who is offering gratification to someone to obtain a particular type of business. He's not going to get the benefit of it. It's not his company. He doesn't own shares in the company, but he's obtaining the benefit for the commercial organization. So he is associated to that commercial organization. This now extends also to third-party vendors, independent contractors who do work for and on behalf of a company or an organization, or to obtain or retain some sort of advantage for a business or commercial organization and towards the conduct of the business. Now, this is important. It needs to be in relation to the conduct of the business in some way, whether it's an advantage to them, whether it's in some way beneficial to them, or whether it's to retain a particular type of business, get work, get tender, and things like that. Now, in this corporate setting, which I'm referring to, and in this organization that I'm referring to, it can extend to a variety and types of entities. These include private limited companies, public listed companies, corporations, and organizations. And to some extent, it also extends to NGOs, societies, and nonprofit organizations. All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Now, corruption offences are set out in Section 16 and 17 of the MACC Act 2009, which refers to bribery. This is the giving and accepting of gratification, which is induced to or for reward. Now, giving or using false documents to make claims and mislead falls under Section 18 of the MACC Act. That too amounts to an offence, or an abuse of public office for pecuniary advantage. And you see all sorts of this as well under Section 23 of the MACC Act in relation to abuse of public office, whether you're a government official and you're using that, to a pecuniary advantage to yourself because you're in a certain position, and that's clearly abuse of office. Penalties. I think we've already gone through this, so just very briefly, you're liable up to a fine of not less than 10 times the value of the gratification. So if the gratification offered was 10,000 ringgit, so 10 times of that, or 1 million, whichever is the higher. Imprisonment for a term not exceeding 20 years. Quite hefty, as you can see, imprisonment for a term of 20 years. And this is what quite worrying as well, under Section 17A is or both. So there is a discretionary clause here, which allows 1, either a fine, 2, imprisonment, or 3, fine and imprisonment. So as you can imagine, this is the reason why a lot of directors have now, to put it bluntly, gotten their act together to ensure that some sort of policy is in place in their organization, so they are not liable for things which they were not aware of, perhaps, from their employees or someone associated to the company, because now under Section 17A, they may possibly get into trouble. Now, this is where I'll explain a little bit as to the link of who are associated and what is a commercial organization. These are the list of, well, again, it's not comprehensive. These are the list of commercial organizations which fall under Section 17A, subsection 8 of the MACC Act. You've got companies incorporated under the Companies Act 2016 with businesses in Malaysia or elsewhere. You've got a company incorporated and carries on business here in Malaysia, a partnership under the Partnership Act, limited liability partnership as well, that's an LLP, or partnerships wherever formed and carries on business in Malaysia. Persons associated, like what I highlighted earlier in the definition, it is important to take note of the word associated. A person associated with a commercial organization may be any of the following. Again, this is not comprehensive, but under Section 17A, subsection 6, it specifically mentions you are director of the commercial organization, fairly simple, partner of the commercial organization. This is for instances where it is a partnership. And then you've got employees of the commercial organization. This is the most key area, because this is where whistleblowing policies are key and important in commercial organizations. And then you've got third parties, who are persons performing services for and on behalf of the commercial organization. These parties could be your contractors, your subcontractors, your third-party vendors, your consultants who use to conduct business on behalf of the commercial organization. Whilst they are not employees of the company, they will still fall under persons performing services for and on behalf of you. Right? So that's associated persons. Now, examples of an offense under Section 17A. Again, this is not comprehensive. These are examples, which is what we see in the corporate sector. Soliciting introducer fees, or what we call red packet. Some people call it red packet souvenirs. Some people call it red packet under table. And these are usually done from the vendors, and they are for facilitating a successful sale and purchase of properties. It's quite common. Offering a fellow estate agent from another agency extra commission, introduce clientele and engage private outside deals. A lot of the table, this also extends to government officials and government offices, land officers, stamp duty officers. And this is where associated persons get in trouble because it perhaps then extends the corporate liability under Section 17A to the directors of the company. And this is when they started to now be wary and what I would say, quickly moving in order to get their SOPs in place to avoid instances where they don't know that this introducer fees has been offered. They don't know that this under-table commissions to government officials or to clients have been made. And so under Section 17A, they now need to come up with defenses, in which we will go through as well what amounts to a defense, how do they protect themselves from getting charged under Section 17A, right? Corporate liability, again, just to summarize, focuses on previously, MACC Act 2009 focused on prosecution of individuals involved in corruption. Under Section 17A, this now extends to commercial organizations' director, controllers, officers, partners, and employees who are concerned and involved in management of that particular corporate organization. And this corporate organizations, commercial organizations, is deemed to have committed that offense and is subject to legal action. So from what you see here and this definition right here, quite a hefty offense, something a little bit unfair and unjust. We'll see. We'll go along to see what are the defenses that directors can use. For offenses under Section 17A, they would then essentially be liable for corruption activities, regardless of whether they did it or not. This extends to a hierarchy sort of structure, top management structure, to make those who are in charge, heads of department, top management, directors, partners of the company liable for offenses that take place within a commercial organization, right? Companies and commercial organizations are legal persons. They can't go to prison. We can't send a company to prison. They're not natural persons. As such, criminal liability of this aspect then falls onto this top management, onto these directors, partners, managers, or employees as well. Right? And if found liable, as mentioned in the sanctions earlier, they can be imposed on companies in terms of a fine and compounding, and then again, imprisonment on the directors, partners, and managers. Now, whistleblowing policies fall under adequate procedures. We've got adequate procedures for Section 17A, which needs to be implemented within commercial organizations. These two extend to whistleblowing policies, which also should be implemented within commercial organizations across the board. A defense to Section 17, and again, this is slightly beneficial in a way where you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, for directors, partners, and employees. Directors having the protection to have a defense under Section 17A, they did not know offense, occurred within their commercial organization, and for the employees to have that protection of confidentiality if they're whistleblowing, if we are to report something. Issues, of course, concerns which arise is where those top management have been involved in the acts of corruption and bribery. They are the ones coming up with the SOPs and implementations. And then we'll discuss that a little bit more. I mean, that's where perhaps areas of concern, a little bit more of tight drafting needs to be included in terms of what and who are protected under that commercial organizations policy. Commercial organizations under Section 17A have to prove that adequate procedures within their organizations were in place for the purpose of preventing the commission of the offense in the first place. And so this is very important because if it is found that commercial organizations didn't have any policy, they didn't have whatever an adequate procedure, which I will explain in detail after this, what those trust principles are included. They don't have that in their SOPs, in their internal policies. It makes it a little bit difficult as to then try and argue that that director, that partner for that commercial organization didn't have knowledge because you don't have any adequate procedures in place, regardless, to prevent the corruption that was of the offense that was commissioned in the first place. So these adequate procedures that I'm referring to are essentially guidelines. They can, depending on the size of your commercial organization, it includes guidelines, internal policies, programs, trainings, and these are set in place to implement, enforce, and monitor. I emphasize again the need for implementation, enforcement, and monitoring. And these are things which will have to be included step by step as well in those SOPs. The burden is on the commercial organization, no one else. It is on the commercial organization to prove that they did have these adequate procedures in place. They were prepared, they were drafted, they were communicated, they were implemented, they've been monitored over a period of time, and they've been enforced effectively. There's no point of saying, I'll give you an example, and this is actually a working example, something that we previously encountered in the legal field is that commercial organizations prepare the draft, they slap it onto their website, no one knows about it, wasn't communicated to anyone, wasn't implemented, and it wasn't enforced. It's just there on the website, it's uploaded, but no one knows about it, no one's given training on it, and no one knows heads or tail of what's included. And that's just a simple example of having the burden of commercial organization to take that extra step to make sure that these SOPs, adequate procedures, are included in the commercial organization. Now, whistleblowing is effective only to the extent of your guidelines as well within your commercial organization, which is why it's important. And this is needed to combat corporate fraud in a corporate setting. It is needed to ensure that investigations and the SOPs are set out very clearly and concisely into the improper conduct that was made or commissioned. Whilst the MACC Act 2009 does not define adequate procedures, the Prime Minister's Office has issued guidelines, and Ms. Cynthia has already pointed out these guidelines include something called a trust principle, TRUST. These guidelines include top-level commitment, risk assessment, control measures, systematic review, monitoring, enforcement, and training and communication. I'll go through it briefly since we've already mentioned it. Top-level commitment involves requiring your commercial organization's top level. You've got your directors, your heads of departments, your CFOs, CTOs, CEOs to ensure that only the highest level of integrity and ethics has been practiced within that commercial organization. Sort of like a pledge and a commitment that this has been set out in the SOPs that we need to see clearly by way of purpose, scope, why we've implemented this policy. That too usually is included on the very top part of your internal policy. And that's sort of like a pledge from the top level commitment that needs to be included. We have risk assessments. Internally, you would need to identify and mitigate both external and internal risks. Transactions with companies that you have in high-risk corruption countries, lack of top-level management and control over finances, that's a red flag. It's a risk assessment that you need to do. Failure to train employees to recognize potential corruption situations. Again, like I said, it's not enough to create a guideline, an SOP, or a policy and slap it on your commercial organization's website. You need to ensure your employees are aware, they know how to look out for corruption situations. And again, this goes hand in hand with whistleblowing, because without them knowing what exactly a corruption offense is, what is improper conduct, they wouldn't know exactly what to report. And that perhaps stems to the fact that our numbers for whistleblowing in the country is very low. Sufficient training for commercial organizations is missing. And that needs to take a drastic change as well. Undertaking control measures, commercial organizations need to have that appropriate contingency plans, conduct their reporting channels with transparency, reliability, and conduct their internal due diligence. Now, a lot of talks as well include, and I think it may be mentioned later on today, there are different software systems and technology that can now include something called anti-corruption compliance programs within the organizations. Your policies and procedures can all be done by ISO softwares. It's anti-bribery management systems, and those can be in place, which a lot of commercial organizations, especially the big ones, have already included within their system as well. Now for the S principle, we have TRUST. So this is S, which is the systematic review, monitoring, and enforcement. Again, your SOPs and your policies are not sufficient if they don't include monitoring, review, and evaluation processes. What are your ABAC compliance programs internally? What are the policies in place? How do you measure performance, efficiency, and effectiveness? Ideally, what most commercial organizations, and we do this when drafting their policies as well, should include a review date. That the policies, as you go along with different vendors and you have dealings with different governmental organizations, you have different projects that you do, they need to be reviewed either on an annual basis or every 2 years. At most, at minimum, it should be on an annual basis, where the assessment for the performance and whether or not that SOP is working internally should be reviewed and amended accordingly, depending on the types of business that you do, because on a year-to-year basis, that business can change within your internal organization. Your review can be in the form of an internal audit or an external audit. That's usually under the discretion of the company. And that's the S principle, which is a very important feature of these procedures. And last but not least is training and communication. Again, like I mentioned, commercial organization is expected to train and communicate all its ABAC policies, including its whistleblowing policies, to all associate persons and contracting third parties. And they need to make this available in different avenues, whether it's a website that they have, whether it's an email blast that goes out to all employees, or whether or not whenever they're submitting a tender for business or they're entering into a contract, it's usually included in the agreement under a warranty. That this is the internal policy they have in place, and whoever they're contracting with needs to abide by that. Now, whilst commercial organizations, it's clear that they can take steps to implement and publish these ABAC policies and whistleblowing policies, they also should ensure that the whistleblowing policy includes sufficient protection, confidentiality, transparency, and reliability. Bigger organizations, I will say, should take the steps to ensure that there is a separate SOP entirely for whistleblowing. Most of the time, what we see is we have an ABAC policy, and right at the bottom of that ABAC policy is a tiny clause for whistleblowing, and that's usually not even more than 4 to 5 sentences long, 4 to 5 lines long. Bigger organizations with a bigger scope of employees, bigger vendors, a lot more third-party contractors should take that added step to ensure that an entire whistleblowing policy is drafted, implemented, and enforced. The whistleblowing mechanisms, of course, in organizations only work when those who are managing the trust in top-level management are impartial, they are transparent, and they promote independence in their entire whistleblowing process. It doesn't work, obviously, where the top management, oh, well, we know we don't need a whistleblowing process because we are the ones actually involved in doing all of this improper conduct, bribery, and corruptions. This is where whistleblowing mechanisms fail, because you then find that the whistleblowing SOPs and policies are not of an adequate standard and don't include the things that needs to be included. Right, so just to summarize what I've said so far, and I do apologize if I'm going relatively quick. I am a bit conscious with the time. Summarizing it, two key points. Identifying risk factors in your particular industry. It could be in the real estate, construction, media, technology industry. It's very important to identify what your risk factor is, because different industries will have different risk factors depending on who you're contracting with. These need to be addressed and highlighted in your anti-bribery and anti-corruption policy. And depending on your type of employees, your size of your company, an entire separate whistleblowing SOP policy should also be in place for all your employees to be aware. This encourages safe reporting. And when you have an internal separate whistleblowing process, it then makes it a little bit more transparent. And I'll tell you why in the next couple of slides. This is what should be included in your whistleblowing policies. One key element is reporting and investigation. The transparency of having your report and investigation process published on your website or published for all your employees to see encourages transparency and encourages whistleblowing as well, because informants will then be in a situation where they want to report if they do come across an act of bribery or corruption or improper conduct, because they know exactly what the internal SOP is. They know how the investigation is going to be conducted, and they know what type of report they need to come up with and information they need to put in order for their confidentiality to be protected. Again, this internal SOPs should ideally be reviewed internally annually, at best and at the most minimum. And that's what we advise our clients as well, that, you know, if it needs to be redrafted, there's a change in your business nature, or there's an addition subsidiary you have in your company. These are things that need to be taken into consideration when we are amending and trying to review the policies to ensure they're always up to date. Okay, so I will give you a brief breakdown of the type of whistleblowing policies that we've previously drafted for commercial organizations. The key areas for those that you may want to consider including are these. Number one, purpose and scope. This includes your top management levels commitment, your pledge that this is the purpose of our whistleblowing policy. This is the scope it's going to cover, and it's sort of like a pledge that we have pledged to ensure that whistleblowing internally within this commercial organization is respected, and this is how we're going to go about it with very clear and concise SOPs. Two, the informant may want to know before I submit information on the type of concern that I have, on the improper conduct, on the type of bribery and corruption, you want to inform them what type of disclosure is included, what amounts to improper conduct within your commercial organization. This differs. Even though we have a definition for say corruption and bribery, we should also be looking at what is the company's internal policies. Is it improper conduct if you know someone has breached this particular ABAC policy? Is the improper conduct due to a breach of the company's code of ethics perhaps that they have? Or is it a misuse of funds? Was it gross negligence? Is it mismanagement? Was it assisting someone in terms of that particular improper conduct or misconduct? These are things that the informants want to know as before they even can do reporting, before they can even do whistleblowing. They will want to know what amounts to improper conduct within that organization. And some commercial organizations extend this very comprehensively to encourage a very broad range of reporting and investigation as well. Item 3 is the most important, I would say, for a whistleblowing policy, because whistleblowers want to know what protection am I offered within the company internally. If I was to go to MECCA and report a particular type of improper conduct, corruption, or bribery issue, am I going to face legal implications within the company? Am I going to get fired? Is my confidentiality going to be respected? And that's something which is very important within a commercial organization, and this promotes transparency as well. Am I going to be immune for any civil and criminal liability? Of course, this is if they weren't involved at all. If I disclose such a thing, am I going to get in trouble with my directors, with my shareholders, with my managers? Am I going to have detrimental action? Am I going to be in disciplinary proceedings? These are things that they want to know internally within the commercial organization, which must be set out in the policy. And then you also have exclusions, which is also common. Some companies exclude certain things for whistleblowers. And then you've got procedures and SOPs for effective reporting. How do we lodge a report? If it's anonymous, which a lot of commercial organizations encourage, how is that report going to be lodged? Is it by way of a Google form? Is it an email? Are we going to set up an entire whistleblowing channel, which some corporate organizations do as well? These are things to consider when drafting that policy. And then lastly, we've got information required, which is standard, mode of disclosure, as mentioned, protection of confidential information. This is a declaration by the commercial organization in the whistleblowing policy to confirm, assure, and sort of give a comfort to the whistleblowers or the informant that their confidential information will be protected, both internally and externally, save and except. There are exclusions to this where it's required by MACC, and this is an exclusion, and this too is a little bit of a concern area when it comes to whistleblowers. Investigative procedures by the company. Some companies do this, some companies don't. Some companies include the specific investigative procedures that they conduct on the accused. Some companies don't. Again, I would always advise including your entire scope of investigative procedures. What's going to be done by the company? Are they going to do background information on the accused? Are they going to research as to what type of misconduct occurred and go through in detail as to what happened and investigate? This is always good because, again, this promotes transparency and it encourages whistleblowing as well because they know exactly what's going to happen step by step. And some companies, bigger companies, I'll give you an example. Bank Negara Malaysia has a standard template form which they have on their website for reporting any improper conduct to be attached in their whistleblowing policy at bottom. So all whistleblowers need to do is click on that template form, fill it up, and off it goes, it gets submitted. That's an easier version, and that's more of an extensive policy for whistleblowing. Right, so key takeaways in terms of corporate, from the corporate aspect for me, before I hand it over to my colleague Vivian to take over the criminal liability aspect of it. It is a company's management obligation to always ensure that your ABAC policies and your whistleblowing policies are in place effectively to combat corruption activities within the commercial organizations. In a corporate sector, because of Section 17A of the MACC Act, this is now key, this is now important, and this is now something that a lot of corporations should be thinking of. Right, with that being said, I'm going to hand that over to Vivian. Thank you very much.
But before we go to Vivian, Cassandra, there's a question directed to you. I would like to read the question. Hi, Cassandra. What is the decent and recommended number of personnel to receive the whistleblowing report, considering the element of confidentiality and check and balance? Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so the question is, what is the decent recommended number of personnel to receive a whistleblowing report? Consider, I can't really see the remaining of that question. Considering the element of confidentiality. Yeah, so I suppose the number of personnel to receive the whistleblowing report would depend on the size of your organization.
Yeah.
If you have a big organization with a lot of people to manage, obviously one person reviewing that whistleblower report might be a little bit difficult because you have people from HR, you have people from finance, whether it involves something in relation to finance or it involves improper conduct, depending what the conduct is as well. That's an internal policy which you have the discretion to decide. Again, proportionately lah. It makes no sense if you have 10 people reviewing the whistleblowing report. The issue of confidentiality is then lost. So depending on the size of organization, usually from the clients that we have advised, it's limited to no more than 2 to 3. And that's the standard practice across the board at the moment, especially for those companies which employees of 50 and 100, between 50 to 100. And of course, the bigger sizes ones usually have different tiers and different rankings in terms of who the whistleblowing report goes to first, and then whether it needs to be escalated to a senior manager after.
Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you. Okay, Vivian, the floor is yours.
Okay, so As Ms. Cynthia has explained to us earlier, the Whistleblower Protection Act 2010 is an act to combat corruption, encourages and facilitates disclosures of improper conduct within the public and private sector. And what this act does is to protect persons making those disclosures from any detrimental actions, provided that such disclosure were made to an enforcement agency. And in this context, we're referring to MACC. So who is a whistleblower? Any person who makes disclosure of improper conduct to the enforcement agency. So Section 6 gives quite an extensive explanation on this particular disclosure to MACC, and it says that a person may make a disclosure based on his reasonable belief. So he does not have to be he does not have to have evidence, he does not have to be certain, as long as he reasonably believes that any person has engaged, is engaging, or is preparing to engage in any improper conduct. Of course, provided that such disclosure is not specifically prohibited by any law, which I will go into in more detail later. And interesting to note is that subsection 2B of the Act states that it includes any improper conduct which was carried out, which has been carried out before the Act comes into place, which is any improper conduct that took place before 2010. And another point that maybe perhaps to take note of is the subsection 5, which states that any provision in any contract of employment shall be void if it purports to preclude such disclosure. So this is something to look into when you're going through your employment contracts. So what amounts to an improper conduct? Criminal offences such as fraud, corruption, abuse of authority, of powers, any mismanagement of funds, violation of ethical standards, or danger to public health or safety. And what are the forms of protection that is afforded? Protection of confidential information, such as your name, your address, your whereabouts, and the confidential information that is provided. You're immune from any civil criminal liability or any liability arising by way of administrative process, such as disciplinary actions. This is important, especially if you are a civil servant. Or any claims or demands against a whistleblower, defamation, or compensation. You are also protected against any detrimental action. And detrimental action here, the Act has actually provided an extensive definition of what falls under detrimental action. It includes any action causing injury, loss, damage, intimidation, harassment, adverse treatment at work or business. And any protection of detrimental action is extended to persons related or associated to the whistleblower. So if you can look at para C, subpara C here, it says interference with the lawful employment or livelihood of any person, and that includes discrimination, discharge, demotion, suspension, disadvantage, termination, or any adverse treatments in relation to your employment, career, or profession, including the taking of disciplinary actions by your employers. And it includes any threats of the above A, B, and C. It doesn't just the actions itself, but the threats of doing such. So here it says that if detrimental action is taken against a whistleblower, all right, then the whistleblower may complain to any enforcement agency, and here of course we refer to MACC. And a person is deemed to have taken detrimental action if he takes or threatens to take detrimental action because the whistleblower has made a disclosure of the improper conduct, or the person believes that a whistleblower intends or will make such disclosure, or the person, or in most circumstances refers to the employer or the public or private body, incites or permits another person to threaten to take such actions against the whistleblower. And anyone who takes detrimental action against a whistleblower, if convicted under the Act, is liable to a fine of not more than 100,000 or imprisonment for a term not more than 15 years or both. So the Act protects whistleblowers in the sense that if in the event any detrimental actions is taken against him or her, he can lodge a complaint to MACC, and MACC will investigate the complaint, and if MACC is satisfied that the employer or the public or private body has taken such detrimental actions, then there'll be a fine of not more than 100,000 or imprisonment of a term of not more than 15 years. And this point to note is that if such complaint is made and the matter goes to prosecution, it is for the defendant, which is the person or the company who took the detrimental action against you. It is he or she to prove that the detrimental action, the action taken, was actually not in reprisal for a disclosure of the improper conduct. So the burden of proof does not lie on the whistleblower, but it lies on the public or private body who took such actions against you. So further protection is that whistleblower protection to an employee in the private body at law or under collective or employment agreement is not affected by the provision earlier. So as if your employment contract has a separate provision, if it has an internal policy on whistleblowing, it is separate from the Whistleblower Protection Act 2010. It is, so you will not, as long as the reporting is made to your employer and is not made to MACC, then all these provisions will not apply to you. So this is a recent case, Muhammad Rohai Lizal, where the High Court held that the section with regards to detrimental action, it includes action concerning employment and matters of a contractual nature. And as I mentioned earlier, protection is afforded to persons related or associated to you. However, such protection is only against any detrimental action. It is not such protection, it is not with regard to their identity or their location, their whereabouts, their address, or civil or criminal immunity. They do not get such protection the same as the whistleblower. They are only afforded protection against any detrimental action, such as maybe disciplinary action by the employers or the private or public bodies. So are whistleblowers always protected? As Ms. Cynthia explained earlier, no. There are exceptions under the Act whereby protection can be revoked or where whistleblowers are exempted from such protection. And what are these exceptions? It is where the disclosure is frivolous or vexatious. It is principally questioning the merits of government policy or public body. It is known by the whistleblower to be false or untrue, or it is made solely to avoid dismissal or other disciplinary action. And the second exception is that if the whistleblower has participated in the improper conduct or has committed an offence under the Whistleblower Protection Act, then he will not be afforded the same protection as other whistleblowers. Finally, disclosure contains information specifically prohibited from disclosure under any written law, such as the Official Secrets Act. So if you have disclosed information which you are prohibited to disclose, such as your duties under the Official Secrets Act, then no, you will not be given the same protection as other whistleblowers under the Act. So as Ms. Cynthia explained too, the OSA actually prevails over the Whistleblower Protection Act. And this OSA prevents anyone, any civil servants especially, to disclose or reveal any documents which are classified as official secrets under the Act. Not even if the purpose is to disclose acts of any corruption or wrongdoings or misuse of power by the body itself. And if you do so, the OSA actually provides that if such secrets are disclosed, the person will be liable to imprisonment for a term of not less than 1 year and not more than 7 years. Another limitation is that apart from the Official Secrets Act, Section 203A of the Penal Code also prohibits civil servants from disclosing any information which has been obtained in the performance of his duty during his occupation of the job. In the event that such disclosure is made, he or she is liable to punishment of a fine of not more than 1 million ringgit or imprisonment which may extend to 1 year or both. So as you can see, there is quite you see Section 203A prohibit civil servants from disclosing any information which has been disclosed at work. And clearly that any information which you have obtained about improper conduct of your higher authorities would have been obtained at work. So clearly this contradicts the sole purpose and intention of the Whistleblower Protection Act. Another regulation which prohibits such disclosure of improper conduct would be the Public Officers Conduct and Discipline Regulations 1993, which states that an officer shall not make any public statement in relation to any policy, program, or decision of the government on any issue, or give any factual information relating to his department. So this governs the public officers. They are not allowed to disclose any information within their work, and includes any explanation of any incident or reporting relating to his department of the minister responsible, or circulate any such statement or information of the minister responsible, or make any public statement that is detrimental or make any comments on the disadvantage or advantage of any public policies which may embarrass the government. And public statements, including any statements or comments made to the press or Facebook or Twitter, or in the course of a speech or any broadcast by sound or vision or both. So as you can see, it is very restrictive. And if in the event it is breached, then a disciplinary authority may impose any one or any combination of the following punishments. It could be a fine, it could be a deferment in salary movement, reduction of salary. So this, as you can see, this also extremely contradicts the Whistleblower Protection Act with regard to public offices. Okay, before I end my presentation, I would like to share with you a few limitations of this act, which perhaps all of us should be aware of. The first is that, as I mentioned earlier, the protection under the Whistleblower Protection Act is only afforded to you if such disclosure of the improper conduct is made to enforcement agency only. It does not include police officers or your company, only if such disclosure is made to MACC. Because Section 8 of the Act says that any person who makes or receives such disclosure is not allowed to disclose such information or part thereof. Otherwise, it is an offence which on conviction will be liable to a fine of not more than 50,000 ringgit or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 10 years. So this is clearly a limitation, because before a whistleblower, as we all know, whistleblower fear any repercussions from whistleblowing and improper conduct of their superiors. So in this case, they are not even allowed to seek legal advice or any entities which the whistleblower may repose more confidence in. Otherwise, they will face a criminal penalty, such as a fine or imprisonment. This is unlike in Australia or UK, where in Australia, the Australian Whistleblower Protection Act states that a whistleblower can actually whistleblow to any person whom, in the circumstances, is reasonable and appropriate for that person to whistleblow. So any appropriate authorities in the opinion of the whistleblower. And in the UK, we have the Public Interest Disclosure Act 1998, where the Act actually allows whistleblowing to an employer or other responsible persons, such as the police officers or any other authorities, and not just the enforcement agency. Another point to note is that in the event that a whistleblower is not happy with how MACC has handled his or her complaint, he or she does not have any other recourse but to also complain to the enforcement agency to look into his complaint. So there is no independent body to actually oversee that, to make sure that this act is actually put into proper execution. So another limitation that I would like to share is that as earlier explained, the Official Secrets Act prevents you from whistleblowing. Section 203A of the Penal Code. So all these provisions, it does not depend on whether the information is actually a secret or not. You see, as long as you fall within the Act, the Official Secrets Act, as long as you're a civil servant, you have control of such information and you disclose it to any other person, then, you don't get protection under the Whistleblower Act. So when protection is not automatic, clearly it doesn't give confidence to the public to whistleblow. So if I can share with you just two more advantage of whistleblowing that the Act has provided is that there is an award. Section 26 provides an award, a discretion to MACC to reward whistleblowers as it deems fit for disclosing improper conduct, but only if it leads to prosecution. However, the amount and the nature of the award is unknown. It's unlike in the US where you get 10 to 30% of the recovered funds, or South Korea where you get USD of 2 million. So I think the legislative government has to do something about this in terms of, if they would like to motivate whistleblowers to report such conducts. So, in comparison to other Commonwealth countries, there are some positive features in the Act, because such as the extension of the protection to persons associated or related to whistleblowers, which many Commonwealth countries do not have, and it covers both federal and state level, unlike the India's Whistleblower Protection Act. And finally, although the Whistleblower Act in Malaysia is quite comprehensive, of course, there are limitations to it. The whistleblowing statistics that Cynthia has shown us clearly show that Malaysians remain hesitant to come forward to whistleblow. So for companies, of course, like what Cassandra has shared with us earlier, it is a burden on companies to actually have an extensive internal policy on whistleblowing.
Thank you so much, Vivian, for your enlighten us with the information. I would like to ask you a question regarding the limitation that you said just now. The protection will be revoked, as you were saying just now, if you were to disclose information not directly to the MACC, right? So how about that company have set up channels? So if I were to use the channel and later on MCC found out that they are not, they don't receive the information firsthand, will it kind of revoke the protection? What's your take?
Yes, unfortunately, I think that's where we see the contradiction here, where if you whistleblow to a company and then you want to get protection from MACC, you can't get both at the same time. So that's why you need to have an extensive internal policy within the company so that your rights are also protected.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, good. That's why we have the new ISO 37002 whistleblowing management system 2021, and this is something for as a guidance for everybody to. Now coming to Cynthia, you're here again. Thank you so much. Malaysian being Malaysian, there's a Japanese pictorial maxim showing that I see no evil, I hear no evil, I will say no evil. Okay, no news is good news for employer. Okay, do you think this is a healthy culture that we are having by not telling the truth, protecting the human right, by trying to hide everything under carpet? What do you think, Cynthia, about the in the Malaysian scenario? The speaker.
Yes. Thank you, Encik Suhaimi. That is the crux of what we should be discussing today. I should have put in a less legal content delivery because I know Cassandra and Vivian are lawyers. Well, so am I. But I think what we need to discuss really is how to go beyond the law to also look at building a more healthy environment and culture for speaking up. And the culture to speak up has for a long time been a big challenge for Malaysians. And it's not just about whistleblowing on corruption or financial crimes or malpractice, but it's a general situation of being afraid to say the right thing. And I think that is what really needs to be altered because that empowerment must come from a sense of confidence from the law and from what do you call very consistent type of approach in actually promoting better environment for saying things as it is. So right now, it's not very enabling because social media has actually helped a lot in getting people to say what they want. But there's also a lot of things about if you say something too much on Instagram or Facebook, you could be hauled up by the cops for saying something sensitive, something that might offend the people in power, etc. And that actually needs to change because we need to be able to empower ourselves, including those that hold power, to work collectively to combat corruption. But many a time it is also about holding power to account. And the powerful people normally don't want to be scrutinized, you see. So there's a push-pull effect. But my whole point is if more of us want to speak up, then that empowerment factor becomes much stronger. And MECC, the police, immigration, customs, and all these different law enforcement that are named in the Whistleblower Protection Act will actually take our complaints seriously. And I think that is one of the impediments also. If we lodge a complaint, is a complaint going to be taken seriously?
Right,
So
the question.
that is another question, is it really worth the while of going all the way to the different agencies to lodge a complaint? Because sometimes, we say we lodge police report, so we really have no idea whether it's for, you lost your wallet or your IC or something. You have no idea whether it's going to be picked up as an urgent complaint. And that kind of confidence needs to be given to people. That first, my complaint will be taken seriously. Second, your complaint will be acted upon in a quick time. And I think this is something we can learn from the corporate sector that have very good due diligence mechanisms because the speed of investigation is something that will also build confidence that, okay, I have this time frame. I know within 60 days, I will know what is the fate of my complaint. Is it like got an issue, no issue, or is it going to be dismissed? Something like that will actually feed into a better culture because that slide that I showed, MECC receives less than 5% from whistleblowers. And that is from their website. That is their data. So it's actually very telling, the state of reporting and the willingness to go forward. So it's very pathetic.
But Cynthia, there's another thing that the problem about the tradition, the culture, especially on gift policy. Those things, I saw my boss giving something or a special lunch to somebody or something, very, very, how to say, in high value. So it's a norm. So I may not be, I'm confused. I'm not sure whether this is a bribe or not. So should I be raising all this? Since I'm also not clear with the policy that drafted by the company. Yeah. So what do you think?
Anyone wants to pick it up?
Because I think Cassandra better one because you are talking about the draft of the policy. Just Cassandra, Cassandra, what do you think about this?
Well, your questions are very spot on, Inche Suhaimi, because that is where the real challenge is. It's really about culture of not openly challenging your superiors. And for me, the framework of private sector leading the way and all is not so much to get there yet, but it's about reporting workplace attitudes, workplace ethics, workplace malpractice that will affect not just me, but my fellow colleagues. So it is also about building awareness among each other about something that we want to say something because something doesn't look right.
Yeah.
And then it goes up to investigation process. So the most difficult is a report about your superior.
Yes.
And we get there only when we have confidence to start reporting on small things that matter, but small things that affect everyone. Let's say, payment for overtime or something like that, and then wages not commensurating the hours and stuff that affect a lot of workers. So this is something that they can put up for, better investigation, better issues and so on. So the big issues are the more difficult ones. And I think that's where we actually need to do a lot of training and preparedness to actually get a reporting culture in place. And we don't have, as long as we don't change the politics of the behavior will remain like that. And I can tell you, the kopitiams and our lunchtime conversations will be so rife with so many complaints. But when it comes to formally lodged complaints, very few people will want to go the extra mile.
Yeah, drink coffee, kopitiam in Las Vegas. So that's a different thing, different kind of entertainment. Okay, coming back to
Maybe
you.
dangle a reward also, that if your case actually gets prosecuted, you go to court, you'll be given a house or something like that.
Wow.
Instead of, those people who don't deserve it are getting ships and whatever else. So it should be a whole change that whistleblowing is actually what you call that, a work of a patriot. So then it should be rewarded.
It could be a lot.
If it's authentic. There are a lot of fake whistleblowers around also. So yeah.
It could be a loneliest job in the world because when you started to whistleblow, suddenly nobody want to be your associate anymore. No one want to be your friend anymore. Is it going to be you or you're alone, a lonely crusade?
You all your friends.
Yeah. Cassandra, you're saying this now, you're drafting the policy, helping companies to draft policies and having all the procedures on anti-bribery. But because of, the policy is not clear, like I just said just now, the gift policy, sometimes people, may use that gray area, by offering bribes, but actually it's not bribe, it's just an incentive. But then come a whistleblower who saw this and started to whistleblow. Then there's another, people are not sure. So how important to have a very clear policy and procedure in the company?
Right, so that's actually a very good question. And I'll give you a case study, actually, a recent client of ours. In general, this is what had happened, okay? They previously were directly shareholders of the company. They had a whistleblower policy, all fine, separate, and they also had an ABAC policy. It was all posted out onto the website. Everything was fine. It was one page. Each was 1 page long. Not to say that length had anything to do with it, but it was very clear and concise in the sense where this is what bribery, this is what corruption is. If you see anything within the company, report. Whistleblowing SOP, your confidentiality will be protected. You're not going to get into any detrimental action. Fine, well and fine. They then come, they do a corporate restructuring exercise 3 years later. Directors and shareholders have changed, have swapped. Audited accounts are being reviewed. They then come across, all of these improper conduct in terms of fund embezzlement that's gone on in between. It then comes to light, okay, well, hang on, we've got our ABAC policy, we've got whistleblowing policy. They come to us and they say, what's gone wrong? We then turn around and say, well, there's a multitude of things that have gone wrong. First of all, ABAC policy doesn't say heads or tail of what amount to that amount. The amounts were very small amounts. So they were 5,000, 10,000 at a time, which wouldn't seem as a very sufficient amount, clearly, obviously. But when you add it up collectively over a period of 3 years, it then amounts to a sufficient amount of sum. And you know, you only find these things layers later when you have a change of top management, and that top management which then came in wanted to do things differently. And they said, you know, okay, we've got a real problem here. A lot of our employees are trying to get tenders and businesses, spending all of these monies, and the claims, oh my goodness, the claims that were coming out from entertainment bills were then, you know, being reviewed. And it was then we sat down and we said, okay, look, you know, something needs to change. And it takes top management to actually identify, rectify, and come to us and say, we want to do this because we need transparency within the company. It doesn't work if, you know, the top management are not interested in doing it. Because then that's what happens. You get, you know, a single page policy which no one knows the tail of what's going on. And so what we did was we drafted a policy which mentions specifically if you receive a pen, it went down to a very fine scope of even a pen, or if you receive, you know, those Chinese New Year hampers where you get a whole entire hamper of oranges. What do we do then? Can we accept it? Do we give it to HR? Do we return it? It was very comprehensive, and it was at least, you know, 25 pages long. And that's something that we worked on with them for months at end because they wanted to be very clear. And what they do is they take another step forward after that to ensure that training every 6 months is provided to all employees so that they know exactly how much they can receive, how much they can give. Are we working within the perimeters here of what we should be doing? And they deal a lot with the land office, STEM office. And so these are things which they needed to implement across the board. And what was very interesting enough was they did not assign their whistleblowing channel to anyone within the top management. It was a complete third party that they had assigned it to, so that impartiality and transparency was there. And this is something that we very much encourage, and we will, you know, it was very easy working with them because they were, you know, very clear in what they wanted to do and their objective. It's sad to say, however, that these commercial organizations and these companies that come to us are 1 in a million. You know, it's not every day that we work with who wants to include things, you know, very concise and comprehensively. And so, you know, you think as well to yourself, if more commercial organizations all take this approach, they're all banded together, they've got comprehensive policies, you know, would that not encouraging whistleblowing across the board? Because everyone would be comfortable, safe. Policies would be transparent. It might, you know, start a sort of engraving, you know, in employees' head that this is the norm actually, you know, because right now our norm is not to these effects and policies. And so that's something to think about in the corporate sector. It's like, it starts there. If we, you know, if we can't, you know, criminal aspect and government agencies are one, but if we start with the corporate sector and they have ingrained in their head that this is what we need to do, then, you know, that starts somewhere at least, and it's something that everyone else will take and they will follow, because then they will get left behind if they don't. So yeah, that's an example of how we tackle that.
Good example, yeah. But when we talk about this now, when you run a policy for that company, okay, suppose that you have a very comprehensive policy, then suddenly there's something happen, there's somebody who would like to raise the concern and become the whistleblower, all right? So what advice do you give to the viewers today? The thing that they need to take into account, such as evidence, what source of evidence they should retain, is it sufficient or not? Because as far from my understanding, sometimes people will think that a video footage should be sufficient. No, handing envelope, we do not know what's inside the envelope. It could be misleading. So what's your advice? Your legal advice. I'm so sorry.
So again, I mean, from our aspect, in terms of the corporate drafting that we do, that is why in one of the slides I had included one of the key areas which must be included under the policy is how to report, what to include. And these are things which must be stipulated. You know, you have some company policies which don't say what to include. So what you find then is very dangerous, because then you find people filling up forms with no basis. There is nothing there to state what was in the envelope, as you correctly pointed out. And so some companies, we've drafted these policies for, have included specifically, you need to give us the time, the date, exactly where it has happened. If you have a picture of where it has happened, that's great. If you have the identity of this person, that's great. The accused, what exactly was in the packet, you need to give us word for word. Did you see the packet with your own? So it depends it depends on the commercial organization that you're working with, whether they are willing to go the extra step. They want that comprehensiveness. What we do actually at firm is we throw in the entire kitchen sink. And we say, okay, we're going to put all of this for you, and you tell us what you don't want. That way it works with the opposite domino effect, because most of the time, well, great, fine. and we're happy. They've got comprehensive, policy. They're happy. Whether or not they actually understand the materialistics of everything that has been included is one thing, but making it as comprehensive as possible is something which should always be included. There's no hard and fast rule as to what can be adduced when it comes to corporate investigation. What they choose as terms of their evidence is up to them. Whether or not it holds water in court is a separate issue later on. But of course, the more comprehensive it is, and again, that policy needs to be there to ensure that people are not reporting, baseless claims, because that's dangerous as well. And that's something that we have done. So Jaime, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Vivian, yeah, I have a question for you, Vivian. A very serious question. To be anonymous or not anonymous? That's the question. So I understand in Malaysia we have to reveal some of our information as a whistleblower, but do you think that's some the whistleblower would like to share with the authority, especially because once you do it, you can never go back. So what's your take?
Well, unfortunately, to be afforded protection under the Act, you have to disclose your identity to MACC.
There you go.
Yeah. Maybe for company, anonymity can be maintained, but not for the Whistleblower Protection Act.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Very, very simple question. But then again, if you were to reveal your identity, so will I be fully protected, or can I be, summoned by court to the witness stand? So can you please share more with the public?
Yes, you may be called to court to give evidence if required, especially if it leads to persecution. In terms of protection, as what Cynthia and I explained earlier, it's only protection in terms of your identity to the offender, to the public. Any civil or criminal action against you personally, but in terms of assisting with the investigation and prosecution, it is likely that you will be called to the witness stand to give your evidence.
Yeah, but if I were to work with the aviation industry, I'm a pilot, I whistleblow about a plane. For sure, I'll never get a job in any from any other company in Malaysia. So how best can you assure me that my job is protected, or can I be expecting some reward? I'm talking about from Malaysia scenario. So any idea on this?
I think that's something that the legislative government need to work on in terms of improving the legislation to motivate people to whistleblow.
Okay, Cynthia, can you please elaborate more on your about rewards? Should it be share with the public about how much amount that they for to so that people are attracted to. It's not as a part, not as part looking as an incentive, something as assurance that if they lose their job, they can look for some reward to sustain them for 2 or 3 years, something like that. Like in the US, as shared just now, they can gain until 15 to 30%. I do know that in South Korea, they give reward, but only for tax evasion cases only, not for anti-bribery. So, can you what's your opinion on this? Should be shared or not?
Well, there's a couple of issues here. The first is to establish that blowing the whistle is not about getting money.
True.
You know what I mean? So
That's
if not, then you
yeah.
get a flood of complaints about your fellow colleagues. And that's not the objective of what whistleblowing is about. So it has to be established that only if you have a real suspicion and you feel it's authentic enough, then you complain. So the motivation should not be money or any kind of reward. So I think that needs to be established. But what needs to be legislated, which is point number 2, is that it has to be transparent enough that if the case actually goes for prosecution, there's really substantive elements for prosecution. And if the case is won, which means that the whistleblower contribution to the case is so significant, then those things need to be legislated in the law to say that the reward should be 5 times the amount of the bribe or something like that. So you're not quantifying whether it's 1 million or 500,000, but you're saying, okay, if the bribe was so big and the corruption, so, if like we're talking about 1 MDB, we're talking about 7 billion US dollars missing. So then the persons who stole it should actually be compounded so that the whistleblowers who actually reveal the case first should be rewarded for a certain degree. But 1MDB is a very extreme example. So we're talking about all other scandals here, Mara, Felda, all the GLCs and all the different things that keep popping up every other week. I think the point here is to put it in writing that if it goes to different levels, the whistleblower has to be celebrated and has to be given some kind of, public accreditation and all that. It could include money and all that. But the point about the lacking in the whistleblower protection law is that it's not there in explicit terms. It's not transparent also. So given the cronyism level in our country, it really depends on who you are and how you're connected and how much you could be rewarded as a result of that, and that needs to be addressed as well. So in reforming the whistleblower protection laws, I think we need to actually look at reforming a few other laws. So it's not in isolation on its own. But for regular folks who aren't lawyers, business people, everyone who's just out there to make a good living. And I think it's very important that over and above the law, it's about holding the people we have entrusted with power to be accountable to us. That's the framework, that they don't abuse their powers just because we gave them the power. It is about holding them to account. And one of the ways to do that is to do it collectively and to actually assert the need for more transparency and information on everything. I really don't understand for the life of me, for the many years that I'm doing the work that I do, why is everything so secret in this country? Even municipal council minutes, which is not a threat to national security at all, it's got that solid chop on it. What are they protecting, It's nothing to do with national security. So if there's a tall building coming up in front of my house, I need to know why that building is coming up. Who's the contractor? How much does it cost? Why is the building taking up a big place from a public park, etc.? I just don't have that kind of information. So then you depend on insiders to tell you, and then you look for brave people to write articles, and all that. So this entire thing can be restructured if we are actually empowered with access to information. So which is why I'm saying my point about amending the Whistleblower Protection Act is good for one thing, that the task force is now looking at reporting complaints at the workplace.
But Cynthia,
it's also linked to access to information.
Cynthia, there's we should learn from Sri Lanka, right? They are at the brink of bankruptcy because of corruptions. So why have we not learned from real case study? So this is one thing what do you think about? Should we wait until the end, until what happened to second? There's no more fuel, people cannot go to work, children cannot go to school because the country cannot pay for the fuel to come in. So is that something that we are going to we are heading?
I just feel that the challenges are very multi-layered, and that the people who can actually stop us from going there are busy fighting among themselves, doing whatever else. So that's why I think we just need to speak up, stand up.
Yeah.
And I really do feel that the corporate sector has a big role to play, because this is how the economy generates.
Yes.
And this is where it will hurt the the authorities and the people in power. So they have to learn how to behave as well.
Yeah.
If the corporate sector actually paves the way for corporate business integrity and actually says, no, I won't invest in a corrupt government, etc. So then they might actually pay attention to restructuring and rehauling, amending the laws, etc. So that's why I think that there's a lot of frameworks now, including, I think, something that we didn't really touch on, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs 16.5, very clear on access to information and fighting bribery.
Yeah.
So we should actually get more companies to adopt these measures. And then, then you tell the government, these are my terms. So you have to meet these terms, and you have to make it sustainable. So I think that's where we are trying to move this whole thing. And that's why I think your center doing this today is really important for private sector to feel that they have the power.
Yeah, we will do. Professor need to chip in and do the job. Okay, so it's a mutual responsibility. Cassandra, Vivian, I like the one that when you talk about, whistleblowing channel being handled by third party. I remember Singapore Airline, their whistleblowing channel is handled and managed by Deloitte. Yeah. So any whistleblower want to like to file report, they can go to a link where they can log using a extra password, and they can remain anonymous, but they need to provide some details, and they can have a log. So day one I saw they do something, so it'll be more transparent. But do you think this is highly recommended to be carried out in Malaysia? But then again, according to Vivian, the protection will revoke if we do not go through directly to MDCC. So what do you think, Cassandra and Vivian, about this? Cassandra first.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a tough question. So if you see Singapore Airlines, actually what they also do is most of their whistleblowing channels is also directed to the Civil Aviation Authority in Singapore. They're quite smart that way because they want to make it, direct, and we're completely impartial and transparent. The problem with doing that, and the problem with doing something like that, and I'm going to quote Ms. Cynthia, like she quite rightly put, when you have a country run by, there's a lot of cronyism going on, it's a little bit difficult to direct your queries to, you see, ideally for a specific industry within that commercial organization, it would be good for that whistleblowing channel to be directed to that governing authority, be it if it's a manufacturing sector, be it, if it's a specific real estate. But the problem with doing that and giving that power to the third party is you introduce then a new level of corruption and bribery, which is what we're trying to avoid in the first place. And so a lot of these private commercial organizations, what they're trying to do now is use third party channels who are completely impartial. And these could be like Deloitte, EY, they're the auditors, they're the accountants, they're the ones that go through the audited accounts anyway. They pick out and nitpick. Again, level of discretion here is, concerns is also afforded. You have a certain level of issues within the auditing and accounting companies where they may not pick up on certain items where misconduct, embezzlement, and fraud and things like that. So some people have actually moved to trust companies. We have had clients who used completely third-party trust companies, and they hold this information on trust. Confidential information for this whistleblowing channel is held on trust. Problem with this, again, concern here is commercial organizations sometimes, depending on the size, may not have the specific funds to pay these third-party vendors to actually, oversee their whistleblowing channel for them. And so most of the time it falls under HR, and most commercial organizations is happy with parking, that whistleblowing channel under HR. And that's unfortunately, that's the reality of it.
Oh yeah, there's a case. Everything under HR. So HR will handle this, and handle will to conduct the investigation, and we need to DI everything. At the end of the day, HR had not been trained to do so. There's one. Another question that I think the audience would like to also hear. So how that you think that by having a good whistleblowing channel in private sectors, yeah, independent private channels, for example, not by going to the MCC directly, but go to the channel within the company itself, so that we have a more solid and can be to have. But do you think that this practice is be seen as what the company or the organization is trying to do for cover up. We need try to resolve it, you know, inside rather than sharing from outside. Do you think is the people will look at it as a part of cover up?
Okay, so we'll not specifically cover up, but I will tell you something. Because of the new Section 17A, a lot of directors now are a bit weary. And so they do want to be implementing this to avoid liability themselves. Whether, again, they're covering up to save themselves, it's not really, I wouldn't say it's covering up. I would say it's ensuring that their liability is also reduced. And that's the point as well in trying to come up with these policies, because at the end of the day, to be fair as well, if you do not know of the offence that has occurred, the misconduct that has occurred, not to say I'm covering up my own actions to save myself, but I do need a certain level of protection afforded to myself if I did not know that this offence has been committed in the first place. And that's why these policies are important effectively in the corporate sphere.
Actually, if I can just add on to what Cassandra said, we had actually conducted a separate session before, and one of the things I picked up from some of the multinationals here, I mean, they're also based in Penang and a couple of them in Selangor and all that, is the concern that these big corporations have with their supply chain. And I think that is now a very in thing in the conversation about supply chain governance. Of course, there's a lot of emphasis on forced labor, trafficking issues and all that, the glove manufacturing during pandemic and stuff. But it's actually taught us a lot about how to redirect it to anti-corruption measures on financial crimes and corporate fraud. That the reputation of these big companies is very important to them. And so how the supply chain governs itself is also something which is of great importance to their reputation. That there is a way in which the code of conduct, due diligence and compliance must be followed down the line, because if not, now Section 17A will also mean that the directors themselves could be implicated, unless the defense is that they have all these mechanisms in place, or they really didn't know that their guys are doing it. And another benefit is to try to slowly remove middle agencies from the picture, so that we actually clear about who's handling what across the entire chain of manufacturing and all that kind of stuff. So we do have good examples, actually. So I think your question, Suhaimi, is about looking for best practice and how big corporations actually do it. And what the challenge now is to actually emulate it in the Malaysian GLCs, all these Sendirian Berhad companies and SMEs and stuff. And it's difficult when your setup is small. It's like you have 15 people in the organization, and don't tell me I have to invest in an integrity officer. It just doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? But for those big guys that have 5,000 employees, 10,000 employees, then there's a whole department. But normally also in a economic recession situation like where we are now, into the inflation going up, no jobs and all that, usually the first department that gets cut off is the compliance one. Not always, but it's often the case, right? So
And
I think
training
that's where the
department.
push and
Yeah.
pull needs to happen. And that's where
Yeah.
people like us need to assert the importance of this. And we have good examples. I think we should actually pick up on those to show that why across the supply chain is so important. Because one person is corrupt, then the black name goes all the way to the top. Something like that.
Yeah. My boss is doing it. What's wrong? I'm following my boss. So I see no different. It's a standard practice. I just like to share one good case study regarding whistleblowing. There was this one giant company, Revlon. Women should know about Revlon, right? Revlon Cosmetic, yeah.
Yeah.
So the shareholder, one of shareholder, blew whistle because the company invested in the SAP system when they are going for the e-commerce. Somehow the system failed and they were unable to pick up the inventory and meet the demand. So they lose about 20, more than 20 million. And it is decided the investor, the shareholder decided to sue the company. Yeah. But coming back to you, Cynthia and Cassandra and Vivian, yeah, cronyism. Would should when come to the truth, should you even turn against your friends, close friends, your relative maybe, because it's very hard to speak the truth. But again, it's to do the right thing. What do you think, guys, about this? Yeah, to speak the truth, even though those are involved actually are somebody really close to you, your maybe your relatives, or maybe even somebody that what long a childhood friend. Do you think this is something that we need to think about when we talk about whistleblowing? Is it fact or not? And anybody? Vivian, been quiet, very quiet. Do you think Vivian? I know being lawyers, you are lawyers, yeah. Law is law, but as a layman, somebody from very far away, and not for me to speak up. I know about this person. He's my relative. I shouldn't be saying anything. So, do you think this is something that, yeah,
Uh, I think this is completely a discretion of the individual himself.
yeah,
Like how you have the option to report any criminal activities of your friends or your relatives, um, because I think most of the criminal activity that a person whistleblower will come with quite a hefty fine or imprisonment.
mm,
So, it's really up to the individual.
yeah, the individual. But get to do the right thing. This is the dilemma that people are facing nowadays. We are for airbag. We are bringing in Mr. Ian Foxley. We're going to flow him in from UK for information that he's actually that's the biggest case for corruption, and as a whistleblower, he was able to help the SFO UK, and the company was fined somewhat around $3.5 billion. 3.5 billion. I'm not sure whether Mr. Ian received any reward or not. I'm not sure. But according to him, this is to do the right thing. Yeah, he doesn't care. But for somebody, that's him. People saying depend on that person. But do you think that? But here, from the Malaysian culture, we've been groomed since our young in school. We have been asked to obey, especially orang tua cakap jangan lawan, okay, or those what others I say is also always right. So when you see wrong thing, perhaps you're saying, oh, this is the right things. Those are the things that have been, I think the mindset should be changed, and the mindset should be adjust. Yeah. Before we end for today's webinar, I would like to go one more round, starting with the Vivian. Any last word from you to the audience, Vivian?
Um, I think in general, the fact that the Whistleblower Protection Act has been enacted, and the up and coming companies with their internal policies, this is something that employees and all civil servants and etc. have to look into, and always question your conscience whether, like what Tony has said, whether it's the right thing to whistleblow, and if you whistleblow, whether it protects everyone from the bottom level all the way to the top. It takes the effort of one person to start, in order to combat these fraud and corruption and etc. all the way to the top level. So that's just something to share with all of you.
Yeah. Cassandra, from you, yourself?
I think I echo what Vivian and what Miss Cynthia said as well. I think in terms of moving forward, in our country, we have to start somewhere. One is legislative reform needs to be done. It needs to be looked into. But the problem, we have Malaysian mindsets. Someone else will do it. It's not my job and things like that. So small things we do here and there, like starting in the corporate sector is an important aspect. Don't wait until something has happened in order to address the issue. And a clear example is that's top glove. During the COVID-19 pandemic, and everyone's rushing for gloves, they then come to an issue where, oh no, we have got a lot of facilitation payments going in and out. Now we need to do something about it. Now we will implement an ABAC policy. There's no need to wait until something has happened in order to address the issue. The issue is already there. The issue has already been there for a while. Why not address it now? And the more people that address it, and more people that speak out about it, it then moves towards change of some sort. And that's something that I think I will leave everyone with to think about.
Yeah. In a nutshell, prevention is cure. Yeah, prevention is cure. Better than cure. Okay, well, Madam Miss Cynthia, word to the public, these people from the private sector. We wanted to do our part, to do that one right thing, but it's just a very hard one thing. So any 2 cents from you, Miss Cynthia?
We should do it together. So there's less fear when you have a colleague that's willing to do that with you. But that requires a lot of understanding and training so that you can convince your colleagues. So I think the most important lesson that I learned after blowing the whistle is that you're not alone, and you have to make sure you're not alone. So you get a lot of public support when you stand out and speak up, but that alone is not enough. You just need to also have a group of people to back you up. But it depends what you're reporting on, But of course, if you're reporting about some ethical practice in the workplace, you may lose 1 or 2 friends. But not to be depressed about it. So our mental health also needs to be in good shape. But the point is, if it's real and there's something really bothering you and you feel that you need to report, that mechanism needs to be there, and it needs to be really watertight. I need to trust the system. So as long as I can't trust the system, what is the point of whistleblowing? So the other point is to find a friend to do it with you. And I think the other message is to tell the government to please walk the talk. Enough of all these back and forth task force meetings and nothing really works. Just amend the whistleblower protection law. Recognize that there's a World Whistleblower Day and that we're trying to all make a difference, including in the private sector. So they should do their part. I think that's my message.
Thank you so much. Wonderful message, beautiful message for everybody. We are out of time. Thank you so much for our guest speaker, the lovely Miss Vivian, the Miss Cassandra, and the one and only Miss Cynthia for spending your time with the audience today. I'm sure there are many have been shared. If they want to find out more on legal terms or on legal and legal advice, they can always talk to either to Vivian, Cassandra, or Miss Cynthia herself. Yeah. Without further ado, I think I need to surrender the floor to Mr. Tony to take over, and he'll be do a summary and closing. Tony, over to you, Tony.